Hello and welcome to the program. I am Luke Hunt and this is another podcast for The Diplomat. And with me this evening is Liam Cochrane, who is now lecturing in journalism at Melbourne University. He has an extensive history in Southeast Asia, in particular Thailand and Myanmar. Liam, welcome to the program.
Hi, Luke.
Myanmar is obviously a subject that's close to your heart, and you have several peers, colleagues, journalists that you've worked for in Myanmar at the moment, and I understand some are in prison. How are they coping, and what are you hearing?
Yeah, Luke, this has been devastating to watch from afar. As the ABC Southeast Asia correspondent, I was lucky enough to spend quite a bit of time in Myanmar and do some news stories, but also some longer kind of doco stories. And one of them in particular involved going up to Shan State, and we did a half-hour documentary about the opium situation up there, and we had an amazing time, and we were helped no end by a guy called Han Tha, who is just a fabulous journalist, fabulous guy, and a wonderful travel companion. And we just couldn't have done the story without him. And I know any journalists who've worked in different countries, different languages, will know what I'm talking about. Fixes are so important
Sure.
for that ground research, ground truthing kind of role. So Han Tha was with us for all those adventures and good stories, and he has been swept up in the crackdowns happening in Myanmar since the coup. Because as well as being a great friend to the ABC and so many other international media outlets, he also is quite a big player in the country's media scene himself. Mm-hmm. He co-founded the organisation Kamiyut Media, with another young guy called Nathan Mong. The two of them set up this online media portal, this was a few years back. I think it was 2006 roughly that they started it up, and it was a bit groundbreaking for the time. Yeah, and it became really popular with the young audience, and they sort of blended news and entertainment. You know, there's a bit of celebrity gossip and all that stuff in there to keep it popular, and it became really popular. And so when the coup happened in February and the country started shutting down, they weren't on the first list of people and organisations to get banned and to get imprisoned, but eventually the soldiers came for them, and both Han Tha and Nathan were arrested. And we didn't really hear anything from them for a few weeks, and subsequently we've learnt that what happened is that they were taken to a military interrogation centre and they were tortured. And for Han Tha, that went on for around 2 weeks. He was terribly tortured, and some details have come out about exactly what happened. And it was hard stuff to hear when it's your friend. You know, I'm sure you've had the experience of, you know, we report about bad things all of the time, but when it's someone that you know, it does bring it even closer and it becomes more visceral. Hearing reports about, you know, daily beatings, starvation, having cigarettes put out on him, it's horrible to hear.
Endless really periods in isolation.
Yeah, that's right. So it went on for about 2 weeks for Han Tha. For Nathan, apparently after about 4 days, they realised that he has a US passport as well as Myanmar citizenship. Right. And so they kind of went easy on him or stopped torturing him after about 4 days. So after a couple of weeks there, they were transferred to insane prison, which, you know, in the topsy-turvy relativity of Myanmar these days is sort of a sanctuary of sorts, because there is at least, you know, a more proper prison system running it, and that there's accountability in terms of information getting out with released prisoners.
Right.
So Han Tha has been in prison since then, and is in a really bad way. Nathan Mong was released from prison and deported to the US. I think the US State Department did some pretty strong work to try and get him out, but no such luck for Han Tha. And so that's the situation with him. And I should say, you know, he's the guy that I know, and know best. But there are dozens of media workers who are still in prison. So it's been really difficult to try and work out what to do, what we can do.
Which was my next question, That was my next question, is what can people do? Do you think the Australian government has done enough, given you're down there at the moment?
Yeah, look, I'd love to see the Australian government advocate on behalf of Han Tha. On the basis that he's been a friend of the ABC for so many years. He's not a direct ABC staff member, but we couldn't have done those stories without him.
Right.
I consider him a colleague, and I know that if it was me locked up in prison, Hanthar would be doing absolutely everything he could to get me out. And I think we owe him as much as we can do as our colleague and as our friend. Obviously, Australia's in a difficult situation because the Australian citizen Sean Turnell, who was Aung San Suu Kyi's economics advisor, he's also been arrested and seems to be quite a key figure in all of this. So clearly, the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade are working primarily to get Sean Turnell out. He is the priority, obviously. But I would hope that they are also trying to advocate for everyone who's been arrested unfairly, but in particular Hanthar as a friend of the ABC. And I think, you know what, I think this is a real opportunity for the Australian government, but also the Australian military, because as you know, Luke, the Aussie military have had a fairly controversial military-to-military cooperation program with the Myanmar army, the Tamador. And it's a small program. It's mostly English language lessons and that kind of thing. But it's a symbolic program. And they've always defended that program on the basis that it might not be the nicest army in the world, but we need to be engaged and we need to try and encourage these guys to, improve their human rights performance and all that stuff. And I think this could be an opportunity for them to show the benefit of that engagement and to show that they do have some influence and that this controversial program has actually been worth something.
Right, and it's time for the Australian government to act, I think, if only because there are reports emerging now that Sean Turnell may have contracted COVID-19. And it's one thing to have a bargaining chip on the table, and that's perhaps behind why the government is adopting a softly approach. But if Turnell has COVID-19 and if he potentially fatal, that could be a game changer in relations between the two countries.
I think it absolutely would. Yeah, I think just the fact that Sean Turnell is imprisoned it's a huge deal. I mean, for those of us who've covered Myanmar for a while, Sean Turnell has been this kind of mild-mannered, softly spoken kind of economics geek. I hope you won't mind me putting it that way.
No, not at all. I think you're quite right.
I'm sure he wouldn't. He's a very affable guy. But he's the sort of guy that you'd ring up for to get a juicy quote from, and he'd probably calm it down and talk it down. He's a very moderate kind of guy and very committed to Myanmar as a country and the people of Myanmar. You couldn't ask for a better foreign advisor and friend of the country. So, yeah, I think it would be a huge issue if he does have COVID and if he becomes more unwell. And hey, look, that wouldn't be surprising. The reports coming out of Myanmar at the moment in terms of the COVID crisis are just staggering.
Yes.
I was reading an incredible article from Mary Callahan in the Asia Times, and she's quoting unnamed sources, but apparently informed medical sources, who are estimating that half the population could be infected with COVID in the next 3 weeks. And get this, that the death toll eventually could be up to 10 to 15 million people.
Whoa.
Just staggering numbers. And the sort of the way that oxygen supplies seem to have been weaponized by the military junta. Really concerning stuff. So yeah, in that context, it wouldn't surprise me at all if the prisons are absolutely awash with COVID.
Right, I'm reading a report at the moment from Reuters. The dispatches out of Beijing and Shanghai, with China reporting its highest tally of new confirmed cases since January, and it's driven by a surge of imported infections from Yunnan in the southwest, which shares the border with Myanmar. So the implication is that the Chinese are worried about what's happening in Myanmar, and their spike in COVID-19 is now being driven by that country. And we have to face a few facts on this one. The pandemic is out of control, and the reason why is because of the coup, and simply nothing happened in terms of a response to the pandemic after the military seized power.
Well, that's right, and it couldn't really, because the systems as they existed, the health systems and the doctors were protesting, schools were shut down. That the whole infrastructure of the country has just been decimated, not just by the coup, but also the reaction to the coup, the deliberate civil disobedience movement that's been so steadfast in showing its opposition. And, it seems to have been a much stronger and more sustained response than perhaps the military commander in online might have anticipated.
Yeah, they were delusional about what they thought they'd get as opposed to what they did get.
That's right, and it does seem like the people of Myanmar, they're going to extraordinary lengths to protest and deprive themselves of everything, of food and of medicines and of life,
right?
In order to try and get their point across. So, yeah, it's pretty, it's super worrying, and look, I guess it does, bring up the wider point that this is a cross-border thing, unless borders are actually slammed shut. The problems that happen in other countries are sort of everyone's problem,
Exactly, particularly in Asia.
Sense.
They can shut the borders, but they don't remain firmly shut, and there are people still crossing, and the Delta virus is spreading here into Cambodia. It's all over Thailand, Vietnam. It's certainly changing the reaction and the kind of the face of the disease, for want of putting it another way. It's completely tipped the response on its head, and the headlines in Southeast Asia now, and Indonesia as well, is that is red line, that the health system has reached full capacity and it's at the point of imploding. And one can only imagine that in Myanmar, it's going to be a damn sight worse.
Yeah, absolutely. And it really comes down to the race for vaccines and the different paces that different countries are able to muster there. And that's presuming that there's not another variation of the virus that throws everything else out into whack.
Right.
But I was just checking up about Cambodia, where you are, the rates there, that's the Sinovac vaccine that is mostly being provided, and that the government's saying that about 6 million people have been vaccinated, which if that's the case, that's about 60% of the adult population. But that's not much less than the Australian vaccination, which is only about 7 million and only about 28%. So, I mean, it's quite staggering that sitting here in Melbourne, living in a very advanced country, economically wealthy country with a very, very strong health system, that the national government has seemingly squandered the early advantage that was achieved by these strict lockdowns. And now we're sort of going along at a less than Cambodia sort of level of vaccinations. It's incredible. And also kudos to Cambodia and its health workers for getting that many vaccines out.
Yeah, they've done a very good job on that. The issue now is that infection rates are not coming down, and nor is the death toll. That hasn't come back at all. But at the same time, this is where the impact of the Delta virus is having, where it's really hitting home, is that seems to be proliferating just as the vaccinations are being rolled out. And it's very difficult to tell or determine what the impact is having on the general population.
From what I'm seeing, just from afar, the economic impact has just been devastating.
Oh, sure.
I was hearing that my kind of home away from home, the Villa Lanka guest house in central Phnom Penh, closed down and was selling up all its wares. And that's sad. That's like seeing my home being sold off. I spent so much time there on assignments. But what's your sense? I mean, you've been living in Cambodia so long. What does the economic situation look like from there?
The economic situation has been completely tipped on its head. Western businesses were leaving around the time of the 2018 elections, which was widely derided as rigged, and that just kind of never stopped. And then with COVID, it's accelerated. The Chinese have left, although there are signs that they're coming back at the moment. There's a kind of a small wave of maybe new money coming in, but to drive down the riverfront, everything is closed. Businesses have gone broke. A lot of the old haunts have certainly gone. At Villa Lanka, I had a couple of friends who are long-termers here, and they liked that one. They were over there buying up all the antiques. So if you want a fire sale, now's the time to come and get it. But how do you get it out of the country? Where do you jump from? Where do you jump to? How do you jump back into the country? As that's where I think the whole stranded mentality has emerged from, and we're just watching businesses sink quietly into the abyss and they're not coming back.
Yeah, just awful to see, and must be gutting for all the Cambodian businesses who are sort of struggling by. I was a little bit amused, and I guess, it reminded me of the wonderful, resilient Cambodia that I love so much, to see that when they closed down the markets, there was a lot of inventiveness with throwing vegetable markets on the back of tuk-tuks.
Oh, absolutely.
And lots of mobile markets starting up, which was great to see on a micro level, but how long can that go on?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And the big hotels, and there's lots of them. I mean, a lot of people had been to Cambodia, say 20 years ago. They wouldn't recognise the country now, but there's no people. And I think the population of Phnom Penh has probably gone from, the official population was 2 million. At its peak, it's probably 5. And at the moment, it might be down to 500,000. It's everybody's left in waves. They've gone back to the villages where they can live off the land. They know how to catch fish. They know how to look after each other. They don't get that in garment factories, and they certainly don't get that from the government. Although, having said that, the government here has managed to roll out its own social security system for the first time, where cash payments are being sent directly to impoverished villages in the countryside. And that's not a bad thing. They've put several items on the political agenda and carried them out, but the problem now is that the numbers are fierce, and the Delta variant. And then there are reports, as you mentioned earlier, and perhaps coming through Myanmar and Thailand, of a hybrid variant, a cross between Alpha, which was the UK variant, and the Delta variant, which emerged out of India, and no one quite knows where that's going to take us yet either. So it'll be fun and games for Southeast Asian countries who really struggle to keep their borders closed. We've seen in Australia the state borders between New South Wales and Victoria, how easy they were broken, and the population numbers. And when you get out there in the more remote parts of, say, the Wimmera, the big deserts where there's just not a lot of people, it's easy enough. There's no one out there really. People kind of looking at ways of sneaking across highways and things like that. But in Southeast Asia, there are millions and millions of people living on these borders, and cutting across through a clearing in the trees is normal, and they can't police it.
Yeah, absolutely. And people don't necessarily have the resources to be able to isolate and stay separate. There's a certain level of supply of just food and medicines and basic things to live on that you need to be able to do that, especially if you don't have family around. And
indeed,
I think about, I realise that there's been a massive hit to the garment factories because of the European Union tariffs being taken away and all of that. But
which was in response to the 2018 elections. I'll just quickly add.
I think about doing stories on garment factory workers and visiting their accommodation, and it's little kind of tin sheds.
Yes, it hasn't changed.
Mostly young women sleeping sort of 5 to a bed kind of thing, because it cuts down on the rent, and eating 1 or 2 meals a day of simple rice and soup. And these are young people who are living on the edge already. They're sacrificing so much already so that they can send money back to their families in the countryside. There's not the buffer that I think many people have. We've all got a unique situation with COVID, and I read an interesting, metaphor for it. There's a lot of talk about we're all in this together, and I read today someone saying, well, it's the same storm, but we're all in different boats.
Indeed.
And I think that's a good way to put it, in terms of If you live in a big fancy house next to a well-stocked supermarket, then your boat's looking pretty good.
Indeed. How is the COVID lockdowns in Australia impacting on student life? I have a nephew who just came through film school, and his last year was pretty dull. You're lecturing in journalism. Australia is a great source of journalists for Southeast Asia. How are you seeing the next generation of reporters coming through in a COVID environment?
Yeah, well, I'm teaching into the master's program at the Centre for Advancing Journalism at Melbourne Uni. But look, what I'm seeing, Luke, is just students being hit. All last year students were learning online, and that's not what university is about.
No,
University
it's
is
not.
about having those in-person experiences, about making friends, and about learning things in a classroom and having conversations. And, as much as we as educators can try and replicate that, can try and bring innovative ideas and activities and energy, there's only so much you can do. And there's a huge amount of weariness from students who are paying thousands and thousands of dollars for their education and getting it delivered online. So it's been really, really tough. It's been a real insight for me to have these Zoom sessions. And I guess one thing you get with Zoom is a little window into people's lives, or at least their bedroom or their living room, or
their parents in the background.
That's it. And it's been really, I guess, instructive to see a lot of the international students who, typically will have a small apartment in the CBD, and just to sort of see pretty small little rooms with not much furniture, a couple of postcards or family sort of photos on the wall. Not much to do beyond their device and streaming services and all that sort of stuff. It's really tough. You think back to your youth and your uni days and how much fun I'm sure you had. And
we had a lot of fun. I was editor of the university newspaper and spearheading a protest movement at the time, which included the Tiananmen Square massacres. But my God, we got out there. Thousands and thousands at rock concerts, at protests, people drinking. The way it worked, the socialising aspect, which was always kind of an extension of what you were studying, and it carries on into work, particularly the media game.
Yeah, absolutely. And so there is this there's been a huge impact on mental health, to sort of put it in a nutshell. And I really feel for students. There's some incredibly bright, capable, energetic young people who are studying journalism and who are doing some great work. Don't let me be too negative. We still managed to pivot to online learning. We were filming everything on our phones. I had students were going out for their, they were only allowed out here in Melbourne, where it's really strict. They're only allowed out for one exercise session a day. So it was a matter of, well, take your phone, go and do an interview in the park, put your runners on and do your interview in your runners.
No,
it really did, force all of us to become very adaptive and probably learn some skills that will continue being handy.
And on a quick note, we've got press clubs up here advocating that journalists should self-test for COVID before going out into the field, which I'm struggling to get used to because I've had the 2 shots. I'm always wearing a mask. I'm not a nurse. Am I supposed to whack 2 things up my nose and down my tonsils and get everybody else in the newsroom to do the same thing? Are we expected to do that to people we interview in the field? It makes it a non-starter.
Yeah, look, and I'm sure there's a little bit of the COVID cover coming in and it being used. And but it is really hard for journalists to get out and do those interviews. And one thing that we're finding in terms of our students, because we have a lot of international students doing the master's program, and a lot of them are from mainland China. And when COVID broke out in Australia, a lot of students went back home to China, totally understandably, get back to base, get back to the family, and haven't been able to come back to Australia. So that's really added an extra layer of difficulty into the whole operation. Because now we find ourselves trying to teach journalism not just to students and international students and Chinese students in Australia, but we're trying to teach journalism to students who are physically in China and living under the laws and norms of the Chinese Communist Party,
which is increasingly oppressive.
And it's increasingly anti-media, at least anti-Western media, and the sort of journalism that we are teaching and we stand by as good journalism. And it's a really difficult situation for us as staff to sort of grapple with, but also for students as well, because these are some of the brightest students who have managed to come over to do masters in Australia.
And they're not going to Australia not to finish. If you undertake a master's program, you expect to finish. You expect to get that piece of paper at the end. You have to do the work. To have it disrupted halfway through like this and having to go home and having to pay so much money, and how do the universities deal with this logistically? It must be a nightmare.
Yeah, really tough because as well as getting the education, the book learning,
Right.
students come to Australia because they want to improve their English. They want to meet people from other cultures who think differently from them. And, at least some of them want to have their minds expanded. Like so many of us at university, we want that brain
Yep.
explosion kind of, experience.
Yeah, the wow factor.
That's increasingly difficult to provide or to sort of facilitate. Think about it. How much can we ask of a student who is physically living in China to go out on the streets as a student journalist, put a microphone in someone's face and start asking questions?
You can't do it
in these difficult times.
Exactly. You can't.
Yeah, it's a real balance between doing no harm on one hand, and on the other hand, doing no journalism. It's a real bind. And actually, Human Rights Watch covered this in a recent report about the influence of, I guess, Chinese, or the fear amongst Chinese students in Australia about freedom of speech. And they did come across 3 cases where, because of things that were said in an Australian classroom, the family members of those students received visits from police or other authorities back in China. And there is a real fear amongst those students, the Chinese students, that they may be being monitored, that other students might be sort of reporting on them. And, we don't want to overhype that and give it more oxygen than it needs. But we also have to make sure that students are aware of the risks of even taking a course, of speaking out in class and what they say in class. And it's difficult because what we want is to encourage students who've come from an education system that perhaps didn't encourage speaking out and having discussions. We want that to change, right. But we have to be really careful about how far we push it.
There is a long history in Australia. I won't mention the countries, but I certainly know of some countries where foreign students would study in Australia and America, Canada, New Zealand, Europe, and they would volunteer information and send it back home. And the respective foreign departments would collate this information. And this is how students who wanted a job in the bureaucracy, when they went back, would ingratiate themselves with their governments. But at the same time, I'd never heard of stories like this, where the families of students who may have said something controversial in a foreign university were getting visits from the government. That's quite out of order. And quite terrifying, yeah. I might add, particularly for the families.
We need to keep it, in perspective. That's 3 cases that Human Rights Watch managed to stand up.
Right.
In the hundreds of thousands of international students who study in Australia. But what it has is the effect of fear, and that chilling effect. It's the old Asian expression, kill the chickens to scare the monkeys, or variations of that.
It's
you
true.
Only need to.
That's right.
You only need to make an example of a few people to make the point. And it is a concern that the students are worried about. So look, what we're doing to try and address that is to start each subject with a bit of a preamble, I suppose, and just say, look, this is what we're on about. This is what we mean by journalism. These are the risks of doing journalism. These are your responsibilities as a journalism student. You're all adults. You're doing a master's program. So we'll leave it to you to decide. But if you've got any questions, come and talk to us. And just trying to at least let students know that we're aware about it. And the other thing is, for students who've come from mainland China and have grown up there, that they've grown up with a very limited media diet.
Right.
So they perhaps don't fully realise the risks that might be around.
Yeah.
So yeah, look, it's a difficult balancing act, but we're trying to do it, and we're trying to sort of maintain a bit of energy and enthusiasm, and we're hoping that the current lockdown here in Melbourne will finish soon enough for us to get back on campus, and we get to go back to teaching journalism and doing interviews and, as you said, the fun stuff that kind of lights our fire. That's why we do this. It's filing stories. It brings a satisfaction that I would love to pass on to students, and that I went out shooting with a buddy recently, which I hadn't done for quite a while, and I was as happy as I've been in a long time. It's why we do this job. I just really hope that students can have that experience.
Yep. Liam, it's been great talking to you. Thanks very much, and I do hope the situation improves in Melbourne as it does in Cambodia and Hong Kong, and certainly Myanmar.
Yeah, good to catch up, Luke, and take care of yourself there in Cambodia.
You too. Thanks, mate.